Hi, welcome to a program sponsored by Beaverdale Books and Franklin Avenue Library called Sea of Grass, because we have a book here that we think folks are going to be very, very interested in. It is entitled Sea of Grass, and the authors, David Hage and Josephine Marcotty, are here with me to talk about this book. Now, I just finished it this weekend, and it is as sweeping as the geography it covers, which is the entirety of the grasslands of the Middle West and then on into the West, or past the 98th meridian, as you'll find out in our conversation today. They cover history, they cover science, and they cover some really meaningful concepts. And they're both real journalists who really know how to research and they know how to write. So it's a joy to read. It's more than 300 pages long. Do not let that intimidate you. I got through it pretty quickly, and I made a lot of notes about different things I would love to have them talk about, but I ended up with 88 citations out of these 300-something pages, so we're not going to get to everything that I thought we ought to get to talk about. We'll try and hit some high priorities. I'll give you a bit of an introduction about them, which you'll be able to read later when you buy your copy of Sea of Grass, which is for sale there at the back of the room. Dave Hage oversaw environmental and health reporting at the Minneapolis Star-Tribune for a dozen years, editing projects that won a Pulitzer Prize, an Edward R. Murrow Award, and other national journalism honors. His previous books include No Retreat, No Surrender, Labor's War at Hormel, and Reforming Welfare by Rewarding Work. He is a Minneapolis native whose parents grew up in the small prairie towns of western Minnesota. He lives in St. Paul with his wife, a florist and master naturalist. Josephine Marcotty is an award-winning environmental journalist who has spent her life in the Midwest. She was a reporter for the Star-Tribune in Minneapolis, where she chose to cover complex, science-based topics critical to the community, including economics, healthcare, and the environment. Sea of Grass is a natural expansion of the in-depth reporting she did for the newspaper on the vanishing prairie, the importance of natural landscapes, and the consequences of intensive agriculture. Now, I'm going to ask a couple of questions after they do some opening remarks. By way of qualifying myself for this job, I am a journalist and agricultural engineer by training and experience, and I have headed the DNR as an interim and deputy director in the past, and Polk County Conservation as well. Some of my colleagues from the past are here, so I know we're going to get some really good questions from this audience. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to David and Josephine.
Thank you, Pat. It's so great to be here. As some of you know, Des Moines plays a big role in this book. There's an entire chapter about the waterworks, about agriculture in Iowa. We learned so much visiting here and points west, and it's always so much fun to come back, and we're delighted to be here and delighted that you all could come out. So thank you very much for being here tonight. Let me start with a little bit of background, because Josephine and I have been tinkering with this idea, this basic idea, for many years, and only started work on the book 4 years ago. For some years, I was an editorial writer at the Star-Tribune in Minneapolis, and colleagues of mine and I, we were always writing stories and columns about how to save rural America, how to save those lovely small towns that we remember, or our parents grew up maybe, which seemed to be dying. And one day I was driving to work, and I thought, wait, what if we got this wrong? My cousins grew up in small towns in western Minnesota. They all left a long time ago. They would never go back. And I thought maybe the forces of economics and history are just too powerful. I came across an essay at that time called The Buffalo Commons. Some of you might have heard of it, by two geographers from Rutgers, Frank and Deborah Popper. And they did a history of the Great Plains and said, look, it's been a century of droughts, blizzards, boom and bust cycles, federal bailouts. We should just let the people leave and move wherever they want to move to, the big city, wherever, and turn it all back over to the buffalo. The essay was kind of a big hit. I recommend it. It's really a good read. But it was controversial, obviously, because people who live in Malta, Montana, or Storm Lake, Iowa, don't want to be told that, you know, they should get out and go somewhere else. They quickly pointed out that they didn't intend that people have to leave. It was a thought experiment. But it got me thinking about how we settled this part of the country and land west of here. Was it the right thing to do? Did we do it the right way? And now that Americans seem to be changing their ideas about where to live, living city versus living rural, is there a new way to think about these magnificent grasslands that stretch west from here? How to save them as an ecological idea, how to save the wonderful wildlife that flourished there for so long. And then, it just so happens, Josephine and I, by this time, were working together at the paper, and Josephine had a great breakthrough.
It took a while, but eventually I did. I've been at the paper for a long time. In the last 10 years of my career there, I was the environmental reporter. Is this on?
Yeah, you're fine. Ours is the one that's not loud enough.
Oh, okay. My voice is always loud. I started out, when I started covering that beat, I thought, okay, what are the biggest environmental problems and the biggest issues we have in this state? And, one of them was mining around the boundary waters, and I can't tell you how many stories about mining around the boundary waters. The other was wolves, because Minnesota has the largest population of wild wolves in the country, and that's always another fascinating topic for me. I wrote about Lake Superior, and water issues and climate change around Lake Superior. But the biggest environmental problem we have in Minnesota and in Iowa and in many other parts of the country is agriculture and the way we do farming. Farmers are not bad people. We think farmers are great people. They're incredibly resourceful and smart and practical about the way they go about their business. But our agricultural system causes a lot of problems. And so I wrote a lot about agriculture, and then I came across one study that said, it's not only that we are still losing grasslands, which shocked me, because I thought, we're still plowing up grasslands. And then there came another paper, which was written by a professor who did a more thorough study. And then a third one by another nonprofit. They were all documenting the loss of grasslands, the transition of grasslands to cropland. And this was in areas of the country where you really shouldn't be able to grow corn. It's too dry. There's not enough water. But nonetheless, corn prices were so high that there was an incredible incentive for farmers to plow up grassland and grow corn instead, even if it was risky. So that's what I was writing about when Dave said, let's go for a walk around the office, which we often did. And he said, do you want to write a book? And I said, sure, about what? And that's how we got started.
Can you hear this all right? This
Yeah.
microphone? I'm curious, because you did so much research and you've been to so many places and you've met so many people. In all that work, what were the aha moments? The stops where you were stopped. Oh, that's what's going on. Oh, that's how this works. What were some of those moments?
Well, one of the aha moments was with Jerry Hatfield, who's here tonight. We spent hours and hours of his good time on the phone, and we learned so much about Jerry, about not just agriculture in Iowa, but the connection between agriculture and clean water, and who was doing interesting things on the land. And of course, Amy Beatty, who's here tonight. We learned so much from Amy as well. A big aha moment for me was the important role that grasslands play and could play in climate change. We did a deep dive. There's a chapter on soil, prairie soil, which I got obsessed with the chemistry and the biology of prairie soil. The world's grasslands, the world's soils are the biggest carbon sink on the planet. Soils around the world hold more carbon than forests. They hold more carbon than the atmosphere. And so when we plow them up, as we're now doing in western South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, western Kansas, you release that carbon. What does grass do? Photosynthesis. It takes carbon dioxide turns it into carbohydrates and energy, and then it locks that carbon deep in the soil. As many of you know, these prairie plants have roots that go 8, 10, 12 feet deep. So once that carbon is sequestered away, it's locked away deep. Many of you are probably gardeners. You know what happens. You turn over a shovelful of soil in our part of it, not in Virginia, not in Georgia, not in New England, but here in our part of the country, and it's black. It's inky black. Why is that? Carbon. Grasses and flowers have been storing carbon in that soil for millennia. And so that was an aha moment for me, just why grasslands and grassland soils are so important to the future of our planet.
We had a number of aha moments, but I think the one that I'm thinking about right now is when I was talking to a scientist about the flow of nitrogen across the landscape with water and through the air, sort of the nitrogen cycle, and that it became the research that she had done. She worked for the United States Geological Survey. She showed research. She had research that showed that that we can't just fix nitrogen in the water systems by putting on less fertilizer or changing the way we farm, because there's so much residual fertilizer, residual nitrogen in the soil that moves at its own pace through the soil and into the water. There's a term that she used that I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically historic nitrogen. And it could take, even if we fixed everything right away, it could still take decades for that nitrogen to work its way through the system and out of the soils. So that was just the time scale of it was as big as the landscape itself and how much change we had done to it.
One last thought, and I'll turn this back over to Pat. We spent a lot of time interviewing academics at Iowa State and at the University of Minnesota, a great farm campus in St. Paul, the University of Minnesota. And we were over there one day doing an interview, terrific professor named Forrest Isbell, a guy who was a great friend. And I had been trying to get my head around soil and the value of this. And I finally said, Forrest, should we be, because there's a lot of research saying, we think of food as an infinite resource. It's renewable. You just keep growing food. And there's a lot of research which says, no, soil is not an infinite resource. If you lose it, it's gone. And I asked Forrest, should we be thinking of healthy soil as a finite natural resource, something that's valuable and finite, like gold or oil? And he looked at us with this sort of puzzled look on his face. He said, soil is more valuable than gold or oil. We could live without gold or oil. We couldn't live without soil. So,
I believe that's one of the quotes I marked in my 88 citations. I think legacy nitrogen is probably the term you're looking for.
That's right.
And since we have a legacy farmer, award winner from Practical Farmers of Iowa in the room, Chris Henning, I was hoping you could speak a little bit to some of the sections of the book related to practical farmers and this idea of sparing versus sharing. I was actually on a call with Chris this morning without using that term. I told her this was in the book, and I think you need to speak to that a little bit for us.
sure. As Josephine said at the outset, we are not anti-farmer. The book is critical of agriculture in several places, but we came to feel that farmers are stuck in sort of a system that they didn't create. And we didn't come into this with the idea that, okay, we have to undo everything that Iowa has accomplished for the last century, or Minnesota, or Wisconsin. We're going to get rid of all the corn, get rid of all the soybeans, and turn it back to wilderness. Nobody wants to do that. It would never happen. There are people earning a good living, supporting children and families, sending their kids off to college. Nobody wants to do that. But is there a way to do it so that we are sharing land between agriculture and wildlife? And it was about that time that we stumbled across Practical Farmers of Iowa. Are most of you familiar with Practical Farmers of Iowa? They're just so great. They're so great. My little grandson has a Practical Farmers of Iowa onesie Sunday after a picnic.
Explain they're not the Iowa Farm Bureau.
Yeah, they're sort of adopted. just long story short, the genius, they advocate conservation techniques on the land. You're familiar, cover crops, diverse crop rotations, low-till or no-till cultivation, which reduce erosion, protect soil, in fact, enhance soil, keep the water clean, sequester chemicals, but they don't do it in a preachy, big city way. It's farmer to farmer, and practical is sort of the key word in their title, because they were able to go to farm, and they still do. They've got field days, which are great, and they run their own tests to show farmers, if you adopt this practice, your nitrogen bill could go down by 50%. Your soil will be more fertile using natural practices. And a lot of farmers spend, $60,000, $70,000 a year, $100,000 on nitrogen. If you can cut that bill in half, it's substantial savings. And using that kind of practical advice, they've been able to really spread the gospel and spread the adoption of these conservation techniques.
One of the things that I learned from Practical Farmers of Iowa is that it was another aha moment, which is that many farmers, they would like to break free of the corporate systems that they're part of. They would like to be able to, grow what they want to grow and solve problems in the way that they want to solve it, and using nature and keeping their costs down. I mean, that made me understand very much how much a part of a system that they are in.
One more question and I'll kind of launch, and then we'll take questions from you folks, and I think we'll have a pretty lively conversation going. But with Amy and Graham in the room, and I mentioned those 88 citations, those were lines. There was an 89th citation which said the entirety of chapter 8, which is about the Des Moines Water Works and the Lake Bilstow. And so I was wondering if you could speak to what you see as the future for being able to clean our water with what's happening in our agricultural sphere today.
Let me take one swing at that, and I'll turn it over to Josephine. It's easy to get pessimistic and hopeless in this era. We think about climate change, we think about vanishing wildlife. It's easy to sort of lose hope. And one of the things that really struck, two things, hopeful notes that struck us in the book. One was how many great people are out there doing great work to save the grasslands, to clean up the water, to save wildlife and protect wildlife. We met, at some point we decided this has to be an entire section of the book. We met so many cool people, we want to write about them, and their stories are encouraging. Not to be pangloss here, big challenges. But the second point that was sort of hopeful was that it looks like, even with pretty rigorous academic research, shows that with rather modest changes to row crop agriculture, to cattle grazing, with rather modest changes, we could have huge impact on sequestering carbon, on cleaning up the Mississippi River. Many of you are familiar with Lisa Schulte-Moore, brilliant MacArthur genius here in Iowa, and her research on prairie strips or buffer strips. And she showed in kind of a landmark set of studies that if you could convert just 10% of the farmland to buffer strips, which is sort of native grasses and flowers, in crucial places at the edge of a field, you could have an outsized, huge impact on the quality of the water nearby. Now, I want to be honest, to a farmer, you're cutting my revenue by 10%. I mean, if any of you run a business and somebody said, we're cutting your revenue by 10%, it's not insignificant, and we don't want to pretend that it's insignificant. But her work did show that with rather modest changes on the land, we could start to shrink the dead zone, we could start cleaning up the Mississippi River, we could improve the quality of lakes and streams all across the Midwest.
I think that the solutions we're talking about are not extensive compared to what else is spent on agriculture and in terms of crop subsidies and all of the supports that are in the Farm Bill. I mean, it's not a scientific problem, it's not even so much an economic problem, it's a political problem. And I mean, that sounds bad, but the good news is political problems are solvable. And that's something that that Iowa could work on. We all have to work on it, no matter what state we're in, and we all have a lot of work to do. But that's kind of, in Des Moines, the politics we have nationally has showed up in your drinking water, and that's it's a struggle we all have, but it is solvable.
I'd like to turn it over now to the audience to ask questions that they have, and I've got more, obviously, but I think a lot of folks came here to be able to ask you some queries. So who would like to raise their hand? And I want to make sure we get all the questions answered that people want to ask. So I do ask you that you get to a question relatively quickly, if that's fair, right? So who's got some questions for these folks?
I just wondered if you talked to any Iowa politicians through your research.
The question is, did they talk to any Iowa politicians?
Well, we
about
talked to the
this?
farm bureaus. I guess the answer is no.
No, we didn't.
We could have. I spent a little time. Was there a reason why you asked?
Like you just said, politicians, it's all political.
Yeah, right.
I just wondered if you had singled out any politician to talk to.
My sense is that we know what they would have said, depending on which side of the aisle they're on. Yeah. And it's very difficult. Politicians are much better talkers than we are. And I think that we would not have been able to get them off their dime or off their spot. It just didn't seem like we would get very far with it, I think.
If I might ask a follow-up related to that, and that is really, I'm wondering, to what extent do you believe we could make the kind of significant changes that we need to be making to have an impact on our water quality without regulation?
You want to take
I think that the state and the federal government could fix this in a large part by changing how farmers were subsidized, by rewarding different kinds of activities on the land rather than just crop insurance that helps them when it hails. That they would get support for doing things that are good for the community and for the environment, not just what's good for the commodity companies and for their own farm pocketbooks. And I think it's a structural challenge to change a lot of that, because all that happens in Washington. So it's really hard to get your voice heard there. But I do think that changing the economic incentives would be far more effective than regulation.
Yeah, I guess I sort of agree. We do talk in the book a little bit about the long American tradition of private ownership, private land ownership. Many people believe it was one of the things that sort of made America great. After we took the land away from the indigenous people who lived here first, but that for impoverished European immigrants, including my dad's grandparents, this is the first time they'd ever had a chance to own land. They had worked someone else's land for generations. And so it was this miraculous. One historian we talked to said that the settling of this part of the United States in the 19th century was the largest transfer of land to the people who worked it in human history. It's an amazing accomplishment. And the founders of the country believed that it was a valuable thing. Some believed sort of in a mercenary sense that if you owned the land, you would be more productive. It was the best way to have productive agriculture, have folks own their own farms. Others, like Thomas Jefferson, believed that owning the land made virtuous citizens. He has these amazing writings about the virtue of those who work the land. But the consequence of that is that if you want to change what's happening on the land, on thousands or millions of acres, you can't order people to do it. Somebody will say, this is my farm, I make a living here. So as a result, we tend to use the carrot more than the stick. I think it's fair to say we use the carrot more than the stick. And then to Josephine's point, I think what we would do is just slightly tweak the carrot so that if we're going to support farmers financially, which we do, and which we probably want to, support them to do things that benefit the public good rather than the opposite.
I mean, I'm not against regulation. I mean, I think that regulation has a role. I don't see, I've never really thought it right that some people can pollute the water and other people can't.
Okay, I want to interject on regulation. I worked in field office 5 for the DNR for about 9 years, doing field inspections. And after all that time, it's like, you can't regulate it because you'll have to spend so much budget money getting people out there to enforce.
Right.
So,
It's a
Did
problem.
everybody hear that comment? That really it's an enforcement challenge to do the regulation and be very difficult to be successful with enforcement.
yes.
Fair point. One other thought.
I think
And if-
egregious problems.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. If we go back to the landmark environmental laws of this country, recent history, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, they used the regulatory tool, but they did it because their focus was on what were called point source polluters.
The end of the pipe.
Yeah, big factories, wastewater treatment plants, and so on. Now those are easy to regulate. They're big, they're localized. You can go and measure what's coming out of the plant or the factory, and then you can set standards, scientific standards, and say, but if you're trying to regulate thousands and thousands of independent landowners on millions of acres, very hard to. And that's the United States has had miraculous success. In the cynical era, the cynical, pessimistic era, we forget how much this country has accomplished. The environmental laws of the 1960s and early 70s, when I was a kid, you couldn't swim in the Mississippi River in the Twin Cities. We sort of wanted to go down and screw around. You couldn't do it. Dangerous, full of chemicals, full of sewage, frankly. Now you can swim in the Mississippi River. Water is cleaner in this country, much, much cleaner. The air is cleaner in this country, much, much cleaner. And so the regulatory framework worked in that setting. But agriculture is not covered by the Clean Water Act for obvious reasons.
Dave, let me interject there. I mean, your chapter 8 is about the Des Moines Water Works lawsuit.
Yep.
And the crux of the Des Moines Water Works lawsuit was to sue the drainage districts, these government entities that literally dump the water into our waterways.
Yeah.
Those hundreds of drainage districts around Iowa, because of the Clean Water Act, the way it is written, are not responsible for the quality of water that comes out of it. To the regulatory point, if Des Moines Water Works have been successful in their lawsuits, and like a wastewater treatment, other type of potential polluter, manufacturing plant, whatever, was responsible for the quality of their water, you start to get to the problem that she had as a regulator. You're not going to every field in Iowa. You've narrowed that down to still hundreds, but to a definable group of entities that could be regulated.
Yeah.
Obviously, that lawsuit didn't go forward, but that was the purpose of that, and that's what your chapter talks about.
So,
Yeah, that last paragraph really kind of sums it up, yeah.
so I mean, one of the other points sort of relates back to economic incentives, which is that one of the reasons why we have these kinds of water problems with nitrates in our drinking water is because we grow corn. We grow like almost all corn, sometimes some soybeans, but basically it's a monoculture system. And if the farmers, if we had an agricultural system that was diversified, where farmers could grow different kinds of crops that were not nitrogen intensive, that if there were ways for them to grow cover crops in the winter, then that would go a long way towards solving the problem if you would just free up the market.
Your book does touch on some of this too, in terms of just the food supply, what people will eat, and what the producers will produce and buy. So creating those markets is a challenge, as you highlight in your book. I thought I saw a question, a raised hand over here to my left. Yes.
I was going to discuss the nitrate removal plant that we have that costs millions and millions of dollars that we all pay for.
Yeah.
It doesn't appear that money talks in this respect because nothing is done except we pay for it. You know, there's been no real outcry. I think the politicians would be interested in that somewhat.
You know, I don't know the politics of Iowa well enough to be able to address that specifically. But I think that the fact that the Des Moines Waterworks is now the Iowa Regional Waterworks? Central Iowa Regional Waterworks. I mean, the water systems are broadening their base. They're becoming so that the Des Moines Waterworks is less of a target. And the new water central region includes more conservative, more Republican areas. And so when all of a sudden everyone has the same problem, which is to fix the water, no matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, then then the politics become more manageable, I hope. I mean, that to me seems like, that things could move in that direction.
And if everybody didn't hear her point, she was just talking about the challenge that we have with the nitrates, not really getting any kind of progress made at the legislature with respect to doing something about them of substance, if that's fair to summarize it that way. That's your comment. What else? Who else has got a question? Yes, sir.
Well, again, about the lawsuit that Public Works, that Waterworks put out. Is there an example of something similar that was done in Wisconsin or Minnesota, even Illinois?
He's asking if there's any examples similar to the Des Moines Waterworks lawsuit.
Right. I think maybe one reason it failed here is the judges. You know, who were they appointed by? Republican governor, perhaps,
That's a great
or
question.
other Public Works appointees.
It's a great question. Graham, Amy, do you know, these two would know?
I don't think there's been really anything that's similar to the Des Moines Waterworks lawsuit.
I mean, I would.
Now, there are similar entities in other states. Ohio and other places have drainage districts that operate basically on the same model as Iowa, but nobody's ever targeted that. And I think in part because Des Moines Waterworks ran up the hill by itself and got smacked down, and nobody's willing to do that again. I mean, I think to Josephine's point, Des Moines Waterworks is a small, utility that took on this, because we had a dynamic leader in Bill So, took on this fight all by itself, and nobody's charged up the hill with it. And there are very few public utilities that are willing to do that today, especially in the agriculture state.
You know, when I was on the environment beat at the start of the year when the lawsuit was filed, and I watched it, from a distance for a long time, and I talked to other people around the state and elsewhere about the significance of it, and they were all watching it. I mean, everybody in the water world had their eye on that lawsuit, and it would have been, if someone else had joined in and made it something, bigger, that maybe it would have made a difference. But everybody, was thinking that would be the watershed lawsuit, and it was, but in the wrong way.
But again, that's back to politics and to the point of politics. This Des Moines Waterworks, because of its leadership, was willing to take this fight on. But very few entities are willing to take that fight on by itself. And even during that time, as much as we tried to get others to join the lawsuit, and even try to spread it to other locations, most people were willing to watch and see what happens, but very few people were willing to join the fight.
Right. Yes, Wayne.
Well, to add into that discussion.
All right.
You said the whole water world was like in that lawsuit, so was the whole agricultural world.
Yeah.
From a different perspective. And there was in fact a law proposed that would have abolished the waterworks at that time in the legislature that got some serious debate. It did not get passed, thanks to a lot of efforts of a lot of people. And then I want to go back to something you mentioned about the subsidies. I'm old enough now. I farmed in the 60s with my parents. We had the soil bank program. They paid us not to produce crops. So we have tried that approach before. And I'm not saying it didn't work. I don't have my facts on whether that was effective or not. But the government policy changed when John Block said we're going to go fence row to fence row agriculture.
That's right.
And that's where I think the fertilizer was first, and then that kind of moved the apple cart on down the road.
A Minnesota member of Congress, Colin Peterson, was a guy that we used to know, and when Colin was finally defeated in his race for Congress, somebody said, there was one of two people who understand the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill was so complicated, and to get to the political point, I don't know if this is true, and I don't know if it's true in Iowa, I don't know if it's true anymore, but they used to argue that nobody pays attention to what's in the Farm Bill except for a very small number of senators and members of Congress and lobbyists, and the rest of us kind of think, it's the Farm Bill. What was so great about the lawsuit here and what attracted us to it was that it had a chance to throw a spotlight on this issue. Would it have changed case law nationally? Would it have forced Congress to address the Clean Water Act and agriculture? Not sure. But it would have been an accounting of some kind. One of my sons, very conservative, free market guy, and we have gigantic arguments because I'm a lefty. But my son Sam is very anti-regulation. Government should stay out of it. And I said, well, Sam, then what do you do if somebody's polluting my river, or the river that runs past my house, or putting crud into the air? He said, that's why we have civil litigation. You go to court. There are lots of problems, including the fact that some people can afford lawyers who are $900 an hour. But that was what was so fascinating about the Des Moines Waterworks lawsuit. It was a chance to test this in court. Could you, and again, we're not anti-farmer. We don't mean to say hold the bad guys, but could you hold someone to account for the environmental consequences of what they do, and shine a spotlight on this relationship, which had been, a bit of a mystery, frankly, to most people.
And interesting from a technical point that the other party in the lawsuit wasn't a farmer. It wasn't farmers at all. It was a government entity, these drainage districts.
Yeah.
And that's what made this a viable case, in my opinion.
So sticking with this topic somewhat, did you study at all or investigate at all the impact of all these drainage tiles that have been installed in fields, and what mitigation would happen, what percentage of some of that was removed? And our climate has changed significantly, and we're not getting that wastewater, groundwater recharge anymore because it's all shooting off.
Yeah, great
down
point.
to Louisiana.
Yeah, we have there's a chapter in the book called River where we write a lot about the consequences of tile drainage. There's also a chapter that tells the history of tile drainage. So, we focused on three major agricultural developments. One was the steel plow, one was fertilizer, one was tile drainage. And that is kind of what the three major things that we said kind of made agriculture in the Midwest. But the river chapter looks at the consequences of that, which is so much more water in the river, so much more pollution in the river, and also even though prairie strips will work on to stop surface runoff, most of the nitrogen goes through tile lines and into the ditches and into the river. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of like, once you build an infrastructure, once you build a city, it's like when you build a highway system, it's really hard to build it into something else. And the same thing is true with tile lines, is that we have the system built in, and until it needs to be replaced or is forced to be replaced, it's not going to change. Now, are there ways to deal with tile line water that reduces the amount of nitrogen that gets into the water? I think people are working on it. I don't know of any big system that works. I know, you can run it through wetlands. That's a big thing, but then that takes out cropland. Again, I think the idea is to reward farmers for doing something with that, that polluted tile water, to run it through a wetland or through a grassland of some kind, and to help them grow something else, not just corn.
So why are you so certain the infrastructure is rigidly in place?
Well, I'm just talking about physical.
I know. I've been on
I'm sure you,
inspections.
yeah.
So I'm just questioning that position, saying, "Oh, it's already in. You can't change that."
I can tell you what we heard from a couple of farmers, and some of you may have better expertise on this than I do, but we talked to a farmer in west central Minnesota, Randy Kramer. He's in the just a lovely, lovely guy. He and his nephew and brother farm 1,500 acres, pretty, by Minnesota standards, big farm. Well, Randy can tell you the corn yield of his farm for every acre, every single acre. You got this GPS stuff now and software. And he can tell you if that acre was a little too wet in May of this year, my yield went down by 17%. Or if this acre was too dry, my yield went down. Randy and his partners borrow $1 million every spring, just to put a crop in there, $1 million. And if they lose 5% or 10% on their yield, they might not be able to pay the bank. And so Randy would say, I can't take out that tile drainage, or you can block it up too. I think that would be, his argument. But the point, I'm trying to get
I see
an answer
what
to
you're
your question.
saying.
We've reached a point where we sort of can't back
That's
down
the
again.
infrastructure of the farming system,
Yep.
not the tile drains, and that's where he's locked in because of
Yep.
farming that many acres with that much equipment and that.
Yep.
all that.
It's a systemic piece beyond just the physical aspects of it, although they
And I
play
get
in.
that, and I was questioning, thinking.
Yeah, no, I was talking about the physical thing. I mean, it's that those farmers have those systems in place. It would cost them a lot of money to change it. And I don't think there are a lot of solutions out there that would be widely accepted at this point. I mean, they may come, but,
It's a mess.
Chris?
So I live about halfway up the Raccoon River watershed between here and the top, which is up near Sac City, and I live near Jefferson. I have probably the largest carbon sink in the 5 or so miles around me in a sub-watershed. Just because it probably should never have been farmed. The farm that I live on definitely is that. It's on this above the river. Okay, so the water goes 4 different directions and a half a mile and a mile, and it's in the river. Okay, so my output probably is pretty good. The other farm, a farm that I inherited from my dad, is called Bullhead Farm because when they drained it for the railroad and the barn is from 1915, it has that incised in the concrete. The story is that when they drained it for the railroad and put that levee in that would be the railroad bed, that the bullhead fish lay on the ground and flopped, okay? My 100 acres is a portion of the square mile, maybe 2 square miles. We're in what's called prairie pothole, and it could not have been farmed without draining it. It could not have had roads. It could not have had railroads, and it wouldn't be Iowa if it hadn't been drained. In the county that I live in, 30 square miles, there are some 300 and some drainage districts. Okay? The acres, my acres, those acres, the farmers around me, I have half my land is in prairie of some sort. It's either a wetland, it's a buffer around a creek, it's a highly erodible land, whatever.
Do you have a question for us, Chris?
If you've got flat land and you're farming it, even that farm that I just said has 6 acres in front that you don't farm because it's got those barns on it. You got the railroad that's a bike trail, and then you've got 90 acres, half a mile, a straight rows, and I had a place that when I first got it, I ride in the combine, I ride in the planter. I don't do it, but I ride in it and I look at it.
Are you trying to tell us
Yes,
that it's
and
very,
I'm
very
trying to
difficult to make a
say-
change, or?
I'm trying to say that you can take out that 10%, and you still are farming, and you have taken out that 10% in that 100 acres.
And you're still row crop farming.
And you're still row crop farming, and it's still gotta be drained, otherwise you're not going to have.
Are you making a pitch for regulation?
I'm not making a pitch for regulation, I'm saying how hard it would be to change Greene County into something that would save us here from nitrogen. I lived here 30 years, I've lived there 30 years.
So without being able to make a change, are you just saying all you can do is clean it up at the Des Moines Water Works? And we have to live with it in between here and there?
I'm saying the people upstream of me, lots of them are still pissed about Bill Stowe, and he's been gone how long? He's still one of my heroes, okay? Not everybody I had the luck or the wherewithal to be able to do what I've done, because it was just me, but I didn't have a family.
So maybe what you're getting at a little bit is some of the cultural pressures, some of the community pressures, some of the family pressures, legacy pressures. Do you want to speak to some of that?
Yeah.
Some of what's going on in the culture, because you do touch on that in the book, related to the agricultural sector so far. Go ahead.
One of the themes that runs through the book is progress. And I mean, there's no doubt that draining 1/3 of Iowa was wet in 1810, 1820, huge swamps and marshes and sloughs. And draining that land with tile drainage turned, as you know, into some of the most productive farmland in the world. And people were able to make a good living, send their kids to school. I mean, tremendous progress. Same thing with John Deere's plow, which we write about. People wouldn't have been able to plow this soil without that polished steel plow. Plows from New England didn't work out here. The same thing with synthetic nitrogen. Josephine has a chapter about synthetic nitrogen, an extraordinary breakthrough. We wouldn't have 3 billion people on the face of the earth today if it weren't for synthetic nitrogen. The land just doesn't have that much fertility to it. But we also quote Aldo Leopold, the great conservationist. We're not anti-progress. I have a bunch of pals who are scientists at 3M, the 3M company in the Twin Cities. They're engineers, they're scientists, they believe in progress so much. We do too. But Aldo Leopold said, there are diminishing returns to progress. There are diminishing returns. And the hard thing is to know when to stop. And if you've gone too far, how to go back again.
So, one last question. You talked about tile drainage, the steel plow, and fertilizer. Did you think about hybrid seed as being one of the problems?
Go ahead. Yeah, you touched on that too.
Yeah, we write about that as well in one of the other chapters on,
Talked about BT corn. And
BT corn, yeah, it was, what's the name of the chapter, I'm blanking on it, it's Plow 2?
Plow 2.
Plow 2. That was where we focused on why we're still losing 1 million acres a year of grassland. And a lot of that is driven by technology, like the seeds and the insecticides and, Roundup, where you can just kill, acres and acres of grass with, machinery. So yes, we do touch on that in one of the chapters. When we were looking at those first 3 ones, that was sort of more about history. Sort of, how did they break the prairie in the first place? How did farming become so well established in the first place?
Just to pull back for a little bit of context, something Josephine taught me, the prairie has sort of 3 zones. The experts would say eastern tall grass prairie in states like Illinois and Iowa, where originally the grass was really high, relatively wet states. Mixed grass, prairie around here, and then drier shortgrass prairie out west. Of the tallgrass prairie, 99% is gone. About 1% you find little remnants here and there around this part of the Midwest. But agriculture sort of stopped, row crop agriculture sort of stopped at about the 98th meridian, roughly speaking, eastern border of Kansas, western side of Minnesota, at 1890, 1910, because the farmers thought you couldn't grow a crop farther west. Too dry, too many blizzards, the growing season is too short, and it was with the introduction of hybrid seeds, short growing season, corn, varieties of soybeans that could thrive in places like western South Dakota, Wyoming, western Kansas. And that's when sort of the plows, to use the metaphor, when the plows started again. So that today, of the shortgrass prairie west of here, about 40% remains because it was in cattle, it was in grass, because people thought that's the only way you could make a living out there was grass and cattle, too dry to farm. But with the new hybrids and the new breakthroughs, it's now profitable with crop insurance to grow corn in western South Dakota. And again, to take it the farmer's side, if I can get $4 a bushel for corn, I'm guaranteed $4 a bushel for corn. Why wouldn't I grow corn? I got bills to pay, and that's sort of what's happening today.
Let's take this question over here, and then we'll kind of start to wrap it up a little bit.
Corn and ethanol are all.
Yeah.
Then there's ethanol.
And that's so entrenched in the renewable fuels.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the role of renewable fuels in what's happening with our agricultural sector and our water and climate?
Yeah. We should all stay for an hour of after-school homework, because ethanol is super complicated, as all you know. I'll give you my take on it. It was sort of invented and sold as a green fuel, as a renewable fuel, environmentally friendly fuel. The research we've seen, and there's a lot of research on both sides, but the research we found persuasive said that that's just not true. In distilling ethanol and making ethanol, you release as much carbon as distilling gasoline. In burning ethanol in your car or your truck, you release as much carbon as gasoline. So the credentials of ethanol as a climate-friendly fuel are that you're not digging fossil fuels out of the ground. You're not taking oil or shale oil out of the ground. You're basing it on a renewable natural resource. The flaw in the logic is that assumes that corn is free. It's just sitting there waiting to be turned into ethanol. And of course, corn isn't free. You could use it for something else. You could feed livestock, or you could leave that land in grass and trees. And since the renewable fuel standard went in, I'm going to be a little bit careful with the numbers, check me on this, but before that, corn rarely traded above $4 a bushel. Is that about right, Jerry? Since the renewable fuel standard, which set the mandate for ethanol, corn has rarely been below $4 a bushel. And so all of a sudden, that in combination with the hybrids, it's really profitable to plow up those western grasslands and turn them into corn. A brilliant guy we got to know, he teaches at Princeton now, he was with the Environmental Defense Fund. He said, if you took 100 acres of Iowa land and put solar panels on 1 acre and planted trees on the other 99, you would produce as much energy as you do with ethanol, and then you'd make a lot of progress with climate change.
I just recently read a study where it was a 31-to-1 ratio with agrivoltaics for energy. So I think there's studies out there. I don't know how valid the one I read is. I didn't get to research it in that way. We're about to wrap up here, and so I'm going to kind of give you a bit of an all-encompassing question. Unless somebody out there has just something they're, okay, burning desire, go ahead.
Burning desire. I just want to thank you. I'm here with a little delegation from Practical Farmers of Iowa, and we just want to say thank you for giving a shout out. That's what we're trying to do.
You deserve it.
There's really good stuff in this book about PFI.
So I'll steal her time since she doesn't have a question. I also work at PFI, so thank you for
Executive
featuring us.
Director.
But you talk about incentives to help move the needle, and we recently had a big influx of incentives with Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, IRA funds, etc., that have since been revoked. So the incentives have gone lower, and whether regulation works or not isn't even on the table, especially in Iowa. So with your solutions, how can we bake in incentives that are more resilient to administration changes and that actually move the needle when it's also encompassed with markets and distribution and all the other systems issues?
Dave and I look at each other when we don't know how to answer a question.
It's hard. We're not pessimists, and we can talk about that. But the Farm Bill, my impression, having written about the Farm Bill occasionally for 25, 30 years, is that the pendulum sort of swings back and forth. Congress will add a pretty cool conservation provision like CRP, Conservation Reserve, which took a lot of land out of production, and erosion fell, water pollution fell, the land was idled, which to the point over here is not always popular. You're paying farmers not to grow something, and farmers don't like this. So then there was CREP, so then there was EQIP. So Congress keeps adding really interesting, and in my view, kind of promising conservation provisions. Today, provisions that are for working land. You can grow a crop on the land, but you're subsidized for adopting certain practices in your work, and the kind of thing that PFI is so brilliant at. But then the pendulum swings back, and the next time there's a budget crunch in Washington, they need to take some money out of the federal budget. It seems to be the conservation programs that go first, to get the first cuts. And then, not to get into politics, but I agree with you about the Inflation Reduction. This isn't a sales pitch for Joe Biden or the IRA, but there was so much money sort of hidden, tucked into the Inflation Reduction Act that supported and gave subsidies for these good practices, and now they're sort of being undone and rolled back. So maybe the solution is that the general public does need to pay attention to the Farm Bill. You know, call your senator, call your member of Congress and say, we like EQIP, we like CREP. You would know better than I do, Sally, but it would, if federal policy would change just a little bit, it seems to me it would have huge impact.
One last question then. When I look at your book, read your book, and try to map out in my mind all of the different factors and sequences and interrelationships, I get a Jackson Pollock image, not to come out of that. So I want to understand from your perspective, especially when one of the driving themes in this book, I thought, was we must not dig up these grasslands west of the 98th meridian. What would you say are your top, say, 3 priorities for either policy or program or just cultural shift?
I would say, eat buffalo. I mean, after doing all this research, I'm not sure why we eat beef and not bison, honestly. Bison are the native animals in this place, and I know there are reasons that cattle are easier to raise and they produce more meat, and that's what Europeans got used to. But honestly, I think that not so much, I mean, policy seems impossible because of what's happening in Washington. There might be more policy at the state level that you can accomplish. And what that is, I don't know, other than to help farmers do something that helps farmers do the right thing when it comes to water and climate change, which means keeping things in grass and diversifying your crops. But the other thing that I think is really important is to pay attention to what you're buying. I mean, it's like, I know that we are all used to cheap food and we want processed food, but I think that the food companies and in particular really pay attention to what consumers are doing and what consumers want. And if consumers want it, they want it.
what she said. One thing that we have tried to do with a couple of these conversations is to take this question, what can I do? What difference can I make? And turn it back over to the audience, because many of you are already doing cool things and interesting things, and so maybe if we want to have a conversation after the program is over, we're all ears about promising steps that we can all, Josephine, we're city dwellers, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Josie said, we're just like farmers. And we put chemicals in our front yard. We're proud of our green grass and taking out pollinator friendly.
I mean, you should see the lake in my neighborhood. It is full of algae, and it's not from farmers. It's from grass. It's from lawns.
Yeah.
It's it's the lawn treatment season, and it is ruining my lake.
So we can have a great conversation about everybody's ideas for making a difference. Love to hear that stuff.
Well, I will just add one thing. You did reference in your book how the farm community is recognizing that there are a lot of benefits to the work that they do, and that we are not necessarily giving them some of the payment that we could when they're sequestering carbon and things like that. So that's another interesting layer to consider. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. It's nice to see so many friendly faces in the audience. I know a few of you, and many of you that I do not know. I'm really grateful that you came here for this conversation. I cannot encourage you enough to pick up a seat of grass and actually give it a good solid read. You'll find it exceptionally informative and something I care deeply about, well written. That's such a nice concept to have with a book. I want to remember that Beaverdale Books is one of our great sponsors here. They do so much good work. Please support them. And of course, the Des Moines Public Libraries and Franklin Avenue Library in particular here tonight. And I might, because Jan and I are on the same committee, put in one quick plug for a free event, July 10th, at the Dean Darling Shelter, which is at 2100 Sailor Road, just north of Berlin Marina. Poetry and pie. Come for the free pie, stay for the poetry, July 10th, 5 to 6 p.m. We'll be there. And with that, we are out of here. Thank you very much.